welcome or welcome back, as the case may be. I'm Ellen, a professional historian. The story for today is the story of Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott sending the 50 mostly Venezuelan, some Colombian asylum seekers to Martha's Vineyard. And it raised the question, I think in a lot of people's minds, they saw this being an unusually cruel and an act of trickery. And in some respects that it is true. It was cruel and it did involve trickery. But the other question is, how far out of sync was this incident with just basic, ongoing, decades-long policy regarding immigrants? And I think in order to get into this profitably, we've got to look at the ways in which people come who are coming as non-immigrants. And we use the term immigrant to cover anyone who is coming to the United States, but really an immigrant is someone who comes seeking citizenship and a permanent home here. Of course, immigration attorneys will quibble with me, but I think that is helpful to get started with. So the ways that people come who are not coming as immigrants, who are coming as non-immigrants, there are basically three types of ways that they come. The first way is to come without inspection, which is the legal way of saying they come illegally. The second way is to come legally on an employer's guest worker visa. And the third way is to come seeking asylum, which also is perfectly legal. All right, I've got to stop and pick up my little helper, Carly. I try to get these rascals squared away before I get started. But anyway, so picking up. So the question that I want to keep in front of us is whether there is cruelty and trickery involved in coming without inspection or illegally, in coming on an employer's guest worker visa, or coming on asylum. And I want to say up front that all three inherently involve cruelty and trickery. So let's look at the context of each of these, and let me tell you a few stories that I know from my own experience. And let's talk about asylum first, since that is what this case is about, or the people that are involved were seeking asylum. So I want to tell you the story of someone I talked to personally. He was from Ghana, obviously an African man. He was gay, and he was coming because his life was in threat from his Islamic leadership. He was Islamic, from his family, and from his tribal leaders, all because he is gay. When I talked to him, I learned that he had done everything by the book. He had left Ghana. He had come through the southern border. He came through El Paso. He did exactly what you're supposed to do. He turned himself in and he requested asylum. At that point, he was taken to prison. And he stayed in prison in El Paso for about 18 months. He never saw anything like a judge or any sort of an interview with a lawyer, nothing like that. Nothing moved on his case. He was imprisoned. After 18 months, they sent him to Alabama, where I am, and to Alabama's notoriously abusive prison in Gadsden, Alabama, called Etowah. And Etowah, among many problems, is notorious for not feeding the prisoners what they need, and for feeding them food that has gone bad or is well past their shelf life date. And so here this man was in Etowah, again, never seeing a lawyer, never having any kind of a hearing, eating out of date hot dogs, and having no resources. And when I saw him, he had been there for 6 months. So I don't know how you see it, and we each might see it differently, but I see 2 years being imprisoned on coming into the United States to escape being killed because you're gay, and then keeping you in prison for 2 years, and who knows what it's been now. I've lost touch with him. Not seeing a judge, not having a hearing, not having a lawyer for 2 years. I think 2 years imprisonment in poor conditions is inherently cruel, and it's inherently a trick because it's not what people are expecting. And people who come seeking asylum are in an unequal bargaining position. They can't bargain with the United States. And it's all perfectly legal what they've done. It's legal for a person to enter into the United States and seek asylum at any time and at any place. So, I think to weigh having been put on a plane and taken from Texas to Massachusetts, and there be no jobs there and so forth. Was that cruel? Absolutely. Was it a trick? No question about it. But if you weigh one against the other, I don't see how something like that could compare to a gay man from Africa being kept in prison for 2 years without any sort of movement on his request. So, again, was the stunt, and it was a stunt, was it cruel? Was it trickery? Yes. How does it stack up against day-to-day immigration policy and immigration practice? I think it sort of pales in comparison. So let's talk about the other ways that people come. People come illegally because the United States does not allow them to come legally. And I discussed this in a previous video, but without getting into it, I will just summarize and say that in order to come legally for a short amount of time, someone who wants to apply for a visa has to prove they have a certain amount of money in the bank, and they have to show their bank stubs, all this kind of thing. And it's an amount of money that people don't have. And they have to show title to land. So at the outset, this disqualifies indigenous people who have been displaced. That disqualifies them at the outset from coming legally. Even if they had the money in the bank, if they don't have title to land, then they won't be coming because the United States government wants reassurance that they will go home again. And so to do that, they have to demonstrate strong ties to their home country. And the way they demonstrate to the satisfaction of the U.S. that they have strong ties to their home company is through money and title to land. And so is there any abuse or any cruelty involved in this? Well, you have to know that it is, because we have to look at why people have been displaced in the first place. And anybody who studies recent immigration history or border history knows that the displacement of peoples began, there was a catastrophic impact of the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the countries of North America, their presidents and premier who signed it, the presidents and premier of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, knew at the time they signed it, this is without question, they knew at the time they signed it that they would be signing away life rights for a large portion of Mexico's population. It wasn't a surprise to them, and it wasn't a surprise to peasants and peasant leaders. So NAFTA, what I'm going to get at here is that we, the United States, are not just innocent bystanders. We have helped create the conditions from which people are fleeing. So NAFTA put large corporations like Archer Daniels Midland into direct competition with peasant or campesino farmers whose products were corn and beans, to simplify, and they just could not compete. So when they signed NAFTA, they knew that they were going to be displacing people, and of course the benefit would go to the corporations. So in order to keep people from crossing into the United States, they began to militarize the southern border, and there were various phases of that with various names. Operation Hold the Line was one, and we can get into that in another video. But and there again, the beneficiaries are the corporations and the military the contractors who got the the corporations who got the contracts to militarize the border, to provide the stadium lights, the infrared cameras, build the wall, which started to be built in 93 or thereabouts. So NAFTA, border militarization, and then as part of border militarization, and of course a large part of the conversation around DeSantis has been Republicans versus Democrats, and the sort of accepted narrative is that Republicans are so much worse in terms of immigration than Democrats, and this simply is not true. Sorry, I've got Carly squirming on my lap, and I keep her on my lap to keep her from barking. So, as part of border militarization, the woman who at the time was the head of what became the Department of Homeland Security, whose name was Doris Meissner, proposed to then President Bill Clinton a policy of what she called prevention through deterrence. Prevention referred to trying to stop migrants from crossing the borders, these people that they knew were going to be displaced. And deterrence was a very sort of fluffy way of saying pushing them to their deaths. And so what they did was close off the urban areas, the safest areas for migrants to cross through, and they funneled them into the harshest area of the southern border, where so many were coming through, which at that time was through Arizona, through Nogales, and so they funneled them into the very inhospitable Sonora Desert, and it was anticipated. This is federal policy, and I want to emphasize this. This is United States federal policy, a policy of funneling displaced peoples, displaced in no small part by our policies, to their deaths. These are deaths without charges, jury, judge, and they are simply forced to their deaths. And so far, a minimum of 8,000 migrants have died. And Border Watch has put that number realistically much higher. Is this inherently cruel? Is this trickery? Of course it is. How can it not be in that category? Okay, then we come on down to the September 11th terrorist attacks. And one of the fallouts from the terrorist attacks was that became a very convenient alibi for further militarizing the southern border. And part of that was to change one of the key aspects of the narrative, which is that the migrants were coming for jobs, into putting the worry in our collective minds that they were terrorists or potential terrorists. And so Border Patrol adopted as its mission preventing terrorists and their weapons from crossing our borders. Now, I don't go to Border Patrol's website often, but the last time I went, Border Patrol reports having apprehended not a single terrorist at our southern border. So they knew at the time that people being displaced from their traditional lands and so forth, they're not terrorists. They're coming because they have no option. There again, that is cruel. That is a trick. If it's not a trick on the immigrants, it's a trick on U.S. citizens to try to get us to believe that people that we've displaced are potential terrorists. It's nonsense. So again, we're talking about inherent cruelty and inherent trickery. So then we come on down to something like the 2009 coup d'etat, the illegal military coup d'etat against the democratically elected president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya. And that illegal military coup d'etat was supported by then President Obama and by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And that coup sent Honduras spiraling into a downward pattern of poverty and femicide and persecution of LGBTQ Hondurans and particularly trans Hondurans. And so, all of this, when it's sold as being, a bid for true democracy in Central America, again, it's nonsense. Anybody who knows anything about America's relationship with Central America knows that's just nonsense. And so, of course, there was an outpouring of immigrants, of migrants who were coming to escape violence and so forth and so on. But if you remember, in 2014, a number of children left Honduras. Their parents sent them out of complete desperation at the end of their ropes. And former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, during President Obama's second term, said, well, yes, of course they would be safer here, but we're going to send them back because we don't need them coming here. Don't come. And that's what Kamala Harris said very clearly. Don't come. So again, to compare sending 50 refugees or 50 asylum seekers on an airplane from Texas to Massachusetts, while it's cruel and it involves trickery, I'm not sure that Governor DeSantis's cruelty and trickery quite measures up to that of President Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in that regard. And so now we come to Venezuela, and one of the reasons Venezuela is in the dire straits that it is in now is because of our economic sanctions against that country, because the country is not behaving the way we want it to boil it down to its simplest terms. So my verdict as an historian is that the DeSantis stunt was cruel, and it involved trickery, but the level of cruelty and trickery does not come close to matching the cruelty and trickery involved in our day-to-day policies. And then finally, I want to talk about the other way that migrants can come legally, and that is on an employer's guest worker visa. And we have to keep in mind that the visa does not go to the laborer, it goes to the employer. And there again, if ever there were an institution in which trickery and cruelty was inherent, it is the guest worker program. And the guest worker program was compared, for example, in the Southern Poverty Law Center's report to slavery. Now, it is not slavery per se, but what it is per se is indentured servitude, and human trafficking. I don't see any way around that, and I don't see how we can call indentured servitude and a federal system of human trafficking to be anything other than cruel, and it involves trickery because when guest workers come, they've entered into an agreement with an employer, but the employer holds all the cards. They hold very few, if any, cards. They typically go into deep debt to be able to afford the visa, even though the visa goes to the employer. It is the worker that pays for it. And then when they get here, they are bound to that one employer. So, for example, if a young man comes on an employer's visa to the Gulf of Mexico, thinking he is going to be shucking oysters for a wage that he's bargained for, when he gets there, if the employer wants him for sexual services, there's nothing he can do about it. He may not speak. Not only does he not speak English typically, but he may not even speak Spanish. He may speak an indigenous language. He doesn't have the system. He doesn't have connections, and quite often, especially those in agriculture, are at an even further disadvantage because they are working often outside any sort of town or city environment where they could sort of pick up what is allowed and what is not allowed. So some stories I've heard have been horrifying. I went to central Mexico to video a sequence in my documentary called The Second Cooler about immigration. And I went to interview guest workers who were involved in lawsuits against their employers. And those guest workers were in tobacco in North Carolina, they were in vegetables in southwestern Georgia, and they were in fruit in Florida. And so I'll just relay to you one of the stories that I heard, one of the reasons why they were suing, and that is that in the orange field workers in Florida, again, had contracted to work under certain conditions for a certain amount of money. And so in order to, when they got their checks, they had to, in order to cash it, they had to get on the company bus and be driven by a company employee into the bank where they cashed their check. But in order to get back on the bus, to go back to the fields and to be able to continue working and to be in the country legally, they had to turn over 50% of their paycheck to the employee on the bus. Now that's a trick, and it's cruel. And I have so many stories like that. And I'll tell them to you one day if you want to know about them. But I think that's enough to make my point. So my conclusion, again, is that Governor DeSantis' stunt was cruel, and it was a trick. But it was nothing like the cruelty and the trickery that goes on routinely, whether people come legally as guest workers, legally as asylum seekers, or illegally because they cannot come legally. Our entire immigration system is cruel and amounts to incredible trickery. All right, that's it for now. Please, if you got anything out of this, if you would like, press that like button. If you would consider subscribing, that would be awesome and tickle me to death. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and I promise I will try to answer all serious questions. Meanwhile, have a good rest of the day or rest of the evening, as the case may be, and I will see you back here later. Okay, bye-bye.